I never thought a quiet suburban creek could turn into the battlefield of my life. For 10 years, the sound of running water behind my house was my sanctuary, where my kids caught tadpoles, where I cleared my head after long days. But one morning, I woke to the thunder of machinery and found strangers ripping it apart under orders from our HOA president, Karen Lane. She claimed the creek devalued our neighborhood, burying it beneath rock and concrete like it was nothing more than trash. My heart raced as I realized my family's memories, and even the natural balance of our land, were being erased without warning. I had two choices: bow down to Karen's arrogance or strike back in a way she'd never forget, using the law itself as my weapon. Before I take you into this battle of neighbors, property rights, and secrets darker than anyone imagined, tell me, where are you watching from and what time is it right now? Drop it in the comments below. The rumble of diesel engines shook me from sleep, before the sun had even crept over the rooftops. At first I thought it was a delivery truck cutting through the neighborhood too early, but when the metallic crash of an excavator bucket followed, my blood froze. I threw on jeans and a t-shirt, rushed to the back window, and what I saw turned my stomach. 3 men in hard hats were carving up the land behind my property. Their bright yellow vests glowed against the morning fog as machines roared and claws scooped earth. The creek, my creek, was being shredded into mud. I bolted outside, barefoot, gravel biting into my feet, but I didn't care. That creek had been the reason I bought this home in Cedar Hollow a decade ago. My kids grew up playing here, learning to skip stones, watching fireflies at night. Now strangers were turning it into rubble. "Hey, stop," I screamed, waving my arms. My voice cracked with panic. The foreman, clipboard in hand, barely looked up. "HOA orders. We're redirecting and covering this waterway," he said flatly, as if my land was just another line on a work order. "This is my property," I shouted, stepping dangerously close to the excavator's tracks. "Nobody told me about this," he shrugged. "Talk to Mrs. Lane. We're just doing the job." Karen Lane, of course. Our new HOA president. She had only been in office 6 months, but in that short time she had turned Cedar Hollow into her personal kingdom. Last month she fined me because the bird feeders hanging from my oak tree were unapproved exterior modifications. She once sent me a violation notice for leaving my trash bin out an extra hour after pickup. Petty tyrannies, each one chipping away at my patience. But this was something far worse. She was stealing part of my land, rewriting the landscape itself. I sprinted around the block to her oversized colonial, complete with a lawn, so manicured it looked like plastic. I jabbed the doorbell over and over until she finally opened the door, dressed in her golf polo like she had been waiting to play this role. Her smirk hit me harder than any fist. "Ah," she said smoothly, "you've noticed our neighborhood improvement project." Improvement? I could barely contain my rage. "You're destroying a natural creek. My children play there. My property line runs right up to that bank." She tilted her chin high, every word dripping with condescension. The board voted unanimously. The creek was unsightly, unkempt, and lowered property values. According to Section 8 of the bylaws, the HOA has full authority over exterior appearances. What we're doing will make the neighborhood look controlled. She emphasized the word as if it were divine scripture. Controlled. That was all Karen cared about: control. I wanted to throttle her right there, but instead, I forced myself to step back. I'd learned long ago that when someone like Karen thinks she holds all the cards, the smartest move is to change the game. By sundown, half the creek was gone. Concrete channels had been laid, decorative rocks dumped, and what was once a living waterway now resembled a drainage ditch. My daughter Emma stood silently by the kitchen door, clutching a mason jar of tadpoles she had saved from the destruction. "Where will they live now?" she whispered. I had no answer. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every memory tied to that creek flashed in my head: my son Tyler laughing as his paper boat drifted downstream, my wife sketching the willow trees on summer afternoons, me casting a line at dawn just to feel alive. It wasn't just water. It was our family's soul carved into the earth, and now it was buried under HOA arrogance. I needed leverage, something more than angry words. So the next morning I drove straight to the county records office. The clerk, a kindly woman named Doris, helped me dig through plat maps and easement records. For hours I pored over every detail, searching for the crack in Karen's iron grip. At first everything looked bleak. The HOA did have authority over exterior appearances. Their language was deliberately broad. But then, in the corner of a map, a faint line caught my eye. It was the emergency access road that ran behind the eastern lots, the very road Karen and her allies used daily as their shortcut. According to the notation, half that road fell within my deed up to its center line. So, I actually own part of that road, I asked. Doris peered at the document through her glasses. That's right. You can't block emergency vehicles, but otherwise it's yours. Most folks don't realize what they've got in these old plats. The spark lit in my mind instantly. Karen had blindsided me with her so-called authority. Maybe it was time I reminded her that power works both ways. If she thought destroying my creek was legal because of some HOA clause, then what I was about to do would be every bit as legal, yet far more disruptive. On the drive home, I called my cousin Marcus, who ran a trucking company. "How badly do you need parking space this week?" I asked. He laughed. "Depends. Why, I've got room for a few semis, legally. And I think you'll enjoy the story once you hear it. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the plan had already formed in my mind. I would not let Karen erase my family's creek without feeling the cost. If she thought she could bury my memories under concrete, then I would show her just how suffocating it feels when someone else takes away your freedom of movement. That night, I measured every inch of my property line along that emergency road. I double-checked the minimum clearance for emergency vehicles, 12 feet according to county code. Then I mapped out exactly where 5 semi-trucks could park in a staggered formation, leaving just enough room for an ambulance, but not enough for everyday traffic. For the first time in days, I slept soundly. Tomorrow, Karen would learn that she had messed with the wrong homeowner. The sun had barely risen when the low rumble of diesel engines returned to Cedar Hollow, but this time, it wasn't destruction that followed, it was my revenge wrapped in chrome and steel. My cousin Marcus led the convoy, 5 gleaming semi-trucks trailing behind him like war elephants. Their exhaust hissed in the cool morning air as they rolled slowly into the neighborhood, each one a symbol of the leverage I'd discovered buried in old county records. "Line them up right here," I directed, pointing to the gravel strip that marked my portion of the easement. Marcus grinned, already amused by my audacity. One by one, the rigs hissed to a halt, parking diagonally across the road in a staggered formation. I checked each angle with the tape measure I'd carried all night, ensuring that the passage left exactly 14 feet of clearance, 2 feet more than the legal minimum. Every truck sat squarely on my property line. Every truck was untouchable by the HOA. When the final engine cut off, silence fell across the street, broken only by the chirping of birds and the distant hum of sprinklers. My heart pounded with exhilaration. For once, I wasn't the one cornered. For once, I had the upper hand. The first to notice was Elaine Peters, Karen's closest ally on the HOA board. Her pearl necklace bounced against her sweater as she stumbled down her driveway, jaw slack. "What on earth?" she sputtered, clutching her phone. I smiled politely. "Just parking on my property. Perfectly legal." She snapped a picture and stormed off, no doubt rushing to text Karen. Within minutes, garage doors opened up and neighbors spilled into the street, their morning routines shattered by the sight of 5 semis blocking their shortcut. Some cursed under their breath, others gawked with fascination. A few even smiled, though they tried to hide it. Everyone knew Karen had gone too far with the creek. Everyone knew she pushed us around. Now someone was finally pushing back. My phone buzzed. "Karen," I answered, keeping my voice calm. "Good morning, Madam President." "What the hell do you think you're doing?" she shrieked, her voice so loud I held the phone away from my ear. "Exercising my property rights," I replied. "According to county records, half of that road belongs to me. These trucks are legally parked." "You're retaliating," she spat. "This is harassment. I can't even back my car out of my driveway without scraping it." "Then I suggest you use the main entrance like the rest of us," I said. "It's a beautiful drive. Consider it part of the neighborhood improvement project." Her silence stretched thick with rage. Finally, she hissed, "This isn't over. The board will take action." "I look forward to reading about it in the newsletter," I answered before hanging up. I stood there grinning like a fool, the phone still warm in my hand. For once, I'd beaten Karen at her own game by playing it by the rules. But victory came with a cost. By noon, my doorbell had rung 6 times. Angry neighbors demanded I move the trucks. Parents complained about being late to school drop-off. Even Mr. Quinn, the smooth-talking developer who'd recently joined the board, showed up in his tailored suit, warning that my stunt would tank property values. Each time, I calmly produced my folder of documents highlighting the easement maps, the county codes, and my surveyor's notes. "The trucks stay," I said, again and again. Some stormed off furious, but others hesitated, eyes darting with uncertainty. When I mentioned the creek, how it had been filled without permits, how no one was notified, some softened. They remembered that Karen had crossed a line first. By evening, Karen called for an emergency HOA meeting at the community center. I arrived early, clutching my folder like a shield. The room buzzed with anger, neighbors packed shoulder to shoulder, their voices clashing in a chaotic chorus. Karen stood at the front with her allies radiating smug authority. She banged the gavel until silence rippled through the crowd. "This emergency meeting is called to address a grave violation," she announced, her voice dripping with false righteousness. "One resident has taken it upon himself to endanger our community by blocking an emergency access road with commercial vehicles. Such petty retaliation cannot be tolerated." Murmurs of agreement echoed. I waited, heart-thudding, until Karen gestured toward me with a theatrical flourish. "Would you care to explain yourself before we vote on penalties?" I rose slowly, my palms damp but my voice steady. 3 days ago, the HOA destroyed a natural creek on my property without proper notice. That creek was part of our community for generations, a home to wildlife and a place my children grew up loving. You buried it under rock and concrete because you decided it looked unkempt. I had no warning. No real vote was taken. That is the violation. A hush fell over the crowd. I placed my documents on the table and slid them across. This road, according to county plat maps, each homeowner owns half of the easement behind their lot. These trucks are parked on my land, leaving the legally required clearance for emergency vehicles. They are not a violation. They are a reminder of what happens when you trample a neighbor's rights. Karen's face flushed scarlet. She opened her mouth, but before she could unleash her fury, a quiet voice cut through the room. "He's right." Everyone turned. Dr. Min Tran, the soft-spoken hydrologist who lived 2 streets over, stepped forward with a manila folder. "I've studied that creek for years as part of a biodiversity survey. Its destruction violated at least 3 sections of the Clean Water Act. The HOA acted illegally." Gasps rippled through the room. Karen's smug mask cracked. "That's ridiculous," she snapped. But Dr. Tran pulled out photographs, frogs, crayfish, water samples, all dated and cataloged. "I filed a letter with the board 6 months ago warning against tampering with the creek. It was ignored." For the first time, the room turned against Karen. Neighbors shifted uneasily, whispering to each other. I could see doubt spreading like wildfire. Elaine Peters jumped up, her voice shrill. "These trucks are still dangerous." My Mercedes was nearly scratched, weaving between them. "Dangerous," I countered. "They're parked with 14 feet of clearance. County code requires 12. I measured twice." "Would you like me to show you?" Snickers echoed from the back. Karen banged the gavel again, desperate to regain control. "Enough. We will vote on immediate fines and towing." But Dr. Tran raised his hand. "Before that, I motioned to form an environmental review committee to investigate the creek destruction and ensure compliance with federal law." "I second," came a voice from the crowd. Hands shot up across the room. More than half the residents were in favor. Karen's gavel slammed again, but the sound was drowned by applause. The board had been outmaneuvered. My trucks had forced this confrontation, but now the spotlight was on the creek and on Karen's overreach. I exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment settling in my chest. Phase 1 of my plan had worked. But as Karen's glare burned holes into me from across the room, I knew this was only the beginning. The following morning, Cedar Hollow felt like a powder keg. The semi-trucks still loomed in their staggered formation, chrome grills glinting in the sun, casting long shadows across the access road. It was both a barricade and a banner of defiance. I sipped my coffee on the porch, pretending calm, but inside I was wired tight. I knew Karen wouldn't let last night's humiliation slide. Sure enough, by mid-morning, the first blow landed. A uniformed code enforcement officer arrived in a white SUV with county seals on the doors. He stepped out stiffly, clipboard in hand, his sunglasses reflecting the hulking rigs. "You, the homeowner here?" he asked. "Yes, sir," I said evenly. "Got reports of unauthorized commercial vehicle storage in a residential zone. That a violation of County Ordinance 14.3. I smiled thinly and held out my folder. It would be if they were stored. But they're parked temporarily under private arrangement on property that my deed shows I own to the centerline. Section 14. 3 doesn't apply to vehicles parked within the property boundary." I highlighted it. He skimmed the documents, cleared his throat, and finally muttered, "Huh, looks like you did your homework." He shot a glance at the nearest truck, then at the row of neighbors watching from across their lawns. "You'll probably still get flack, but legally," he shrugged, "I don't see a clear violation here." I thanked him politely, but inside I wanted to cheer. Karen had tried to sick the county on me, and it had fizzled. Score another point for preparation. But the victory was short-lived. That night, the air was split by the hiss and pop of knives cutting rubber. I jolted awake to the metallic clang of someone kicking at a wheel well. My heart slammed against my ribs. I grabbed a flashlight and rushed out the back door, but the figure bolted into the shadows. Before I could catch more than a glimpse, a tall man in dark clothes moving with a deliberate stride. By dawn, the damage was undeniable. 20 tires lay slashed rubber ribbons hanging loose. My cousin Marcus stood there, fuming, arms crossed over his barrel chest. "That's over $100,000 in damage," he growled. "You better believe I'm filing a police report." The police arrived, flashing lights, painting the trucks blue and red. An officer crouched to examine the slashed tires. Vandalism clear as day. "Any suspects?" Before I could speak, Mrs. Henderson shuffled up with her iPad clutched to her chest. She was 78, nearly invisible in the neighborhood, but today she was a guardian angel. "I check my doorbell camera every morning," she said in her frail voice. "Caught this around 3 a.m. The officers leaned over the screen. There he was, James Quinn, the smug developer board member, captured in high definition as he slashed each tire with a hunting knife. The officers exchanged grim looks. "Well, that makes our job easier." They left to bring him in, but word spread faster than sirens. Neighbors poured into the street, gossip buzzing louder than cicadas. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others looked genuinely frightened. "He actually did this," one woman muttered. On camera, I stayed quiet, letting the evidence speak for itself. But inside, adrenaline surged. If Quinn was willing to go this far, what else were they hiding? By afternoon, I had my answer. The county environmental inspector, Maria Ramirez, arrived with a caravan of government SUVs. She and her team unloaded equipment measuring rods, soil kits, sample jars, and walked straight to the mutilated creek bed. Neighbors watched from their porches as if a crime scene was unfolding. And in a way it was. Maria knelt beside the rocks, scraped away soil, and frowned. "Non-permeable fill," she murmured. "This violates Section 44 of the Clean Water Act. Did the HOA file any permits for this diversion?" "Not that I'm aware of," I said. She typed furiously on her tablet. "Then they're in serious trouble. Fines start at $200,000 per day of violation, plus mandatory restoration." I almost laughed at the number, but Maria's face was stone serious. Right on cue, Karen screeched into view in her shiny Mercedes heels, clicking across the gravel as she stormed toward us. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, pointing a manicured finger at Maria. Maria rose slowly, badge glinting in the Sunday County Environmental Protection. "We have authority to investigate potential Clean Water Act violations, and based on what I'm seeing, your HOA is in violation." Karen faltered, but only for a second. "This was an approved beautification project," she said, her voice suddenly syrupy. "Approved by whom?" Maria cut in. "Because we have no record of permits, no environmental impact study, nothing." For the first time since I'd known her, Karen looked rattled. She shot me a glare that could melt steel, then hissed to Maria, "We'll resolve this privately." "Not how this works," Maria replied flatly. "My report goes to the state, and trust me, they'll take this seriously." The crowd buzzed with whispers. For once, Karen had no gavel to slam, no smug speech to drown us out. She turned on her heel phone pressed to her ear as she retreated, barking orders to some unseen ally. That evening, as the sun bled red across the rooftops, I sat with Marcus and Dr. Tran on my porch. The weight of what had happened pressed heavily on all of us. We weren't just fighting over a creek anymore. This was fraud, vandalism, environmental crime, and who knew how deep it went. Marcus lit a cigarette, exhaling slowly. "You've stirred up a hornet's nest," he muttered. Dr. Tran adjusted his glasses. "Karen and her allies aren't just stubborn. They're desperate, and desperate people make mistakes. We need to be ready." I nodded, staring at the hulking silhouettes of the semis still standing their silent vigil. They were more than trucks now, they were a line in the sand, and the battle had only just begun. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for 7 o'clock, but by 6, the parking lot at the Cedar Hollow Community Center was already jammed with SUVs, minivans, and a scattering of pickup trucks. Word had spread like wildfire about the trucks, about the slashed tires, and now about county inspectors prowling around the destroyed creek. For a neighborhood that normally argued about mailbox paint or lawn height, this was a full-blown scandal. I parked my old Ford at the far end and sat for a moment staring at the glowing windows of the hall. My folder of documents rested on the passenger seat, plats, maps, bylaws, photographs. Proof that I wasn't just a troublemaker. Proof that Karen and her inner circle weren't as untouchable as they believed. Inside, the atmosphere was electric. Neighbors filled every chair, lined the walls, and spilled into the doorway. Some glared at me as I walked in, muttering about blocked roads. Others gave small nods of encouragement. A few kids clutched tablets, already recording. Everyone knew tonight could change the balance of power. Karen sat at the front, flanked by Elaine Peters and 2 other board members. She gripped the gavel like a weapon, her face painted with the smug smile of someone who thought she'd already won. The moment the clock struck 7, she slammed the gavel hard enough to make the microphone squeal. "This emergency meeting is now in order," she declared. We are here to address a blatant act of retaliation, endangering community safety and property values. One resident, she didn't say my name, but every eye turned toward me, has blocked our emergency access road with commercial trucks. Such behavior cannot be tolerated. A chorus of agreement rose from her supporters. Elaine leapt to her feet dramatically. My daughter nearly missed her recital because we couldn't get our car out. This is harassment, plain and simple. Karen nodded gravely. Exactly. This is not how civilized communities operate. We are a neighborhood of standards of respect. I couldn't hold back a laugh. The irony was suffocating. Karen's eyes narrowed. Something funny missed her. Hartman, I stood, slowly feeling my legs tremble but forcing my voice steady. Funny, no. Hypocritical, absolutely. I strode to the front, setting my folder on the table with a decisive thud. 3 days ago, you destroyed a natural creek on my property, without real notice, without permits, without a shred of respect for my rights. My children grew up playing in that water. You buried it under rocks because you decided it looked unkempt, and now you dare call me a threat to the community. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Karen banged the gavel. Out of order, but I pressed on. Not out of order, perfectly in order. Because order starts with law. According to the county, that creek is part of a protected watershed. According to the plat maps, the emergency access road is half owned by the adjoining lot holders, myself included. Those trucks, they are legally parked, leaving the required clearance for emergency vehicles. What you did to my creek, that was illegal. A murmur spread low and uncertain. Elaine jumped up again, waving manicured hands. Don't listen to this, he's twisting words to justify his tantrum. Those trucks are eyesores, dangerous. I pulled a folded page from my folder and held it high. County Code, Section 1, 2. Minimum clearance 12 feet. I measured 14. Want to see the photos? Someone in the back chuckled. Others nodded. And then, like fate had been waiting, Dr. Tran rose from his seat. The soft-spoken hydrologist rarely attended meetings, but tonight his presence was a hammer blow. He carried a manila folder thick with reports. I've studied that creek for over a decade, he said, his voice calm but carrying. I've cataloged its species, its role in stormwater drainage, its contribution to the watershed. When the board proposed removing it, I submitted a letter outlining the environmental risks. That letter was ignored. He laid photos on the table, frogs, crayfish, birds. What the HOA did violates at least 3 environmental statutes. The room erupted in whispers. Some residents leaned forward to see. Others turned to Karen with questioning eyes. Karen slammed the gavel again. Baseless claims. We followed procedure. Whose procedure? I asked sharply. Yours, because the county inspectors don't seem to agree. The air in the room shifted. Doubt rippled through the crowd. From the second row, an elderly woman spoke up. Mrs. Abernathy, whose grandchildren often played in the creek during visits. I didn't get any notice about this project. Did anyone? No, hands rose. Karen's face flushed. The notice was in last month's newsletter. In 6-point font buried on page 4, I shot back. That's not notice. That's deception. Dr. Tran stepped closer. I motion we form an environmental review committee to investigate the creek destruction and ensure compliance with state and federal law. I second, Mrs. Abernathy said immediately. Karen sputtered. That's not on tonight's agenda. It is now someone else called. Hands went up across the room. More than half the residents voted in favor. The decision was made. A committee would be formed, and the trucks would remain for now. Karen's gavel slammed furiously, but the sound was drowned by scattered applause. I looked at her, meeting her glare with steady calm. For the first time, I saw something flicker behind her eyes. Not triumph, not smugness, fear. Walking out of the community center that night, neighbors clustered in small groups, whispering, debating, reevaluating everything they thought they knew about their HOA. Some still glared at me, but others offered nods, even a quiet pat on the shoulder. For the first time in this war, I realized something powerful. I wasn't standing alone anymore. Still, as I drove home, Karen's final words at the meeting replayed in my head. You've made a powerful enemy tonight, she had said, her voice, low venom, dripping from every syllable. And enemies of mine don't last long in Cedar Hollow. The trucks were my shield, the documents my sword. But Karen Lane, she was about to show me just how dirty this battle could get. The next 48 hours were like standing in the eye of a storm, eerily quiet on the surface, but with tension swirling all around. I knew Karen and her allies wouldn't sit back after being publicly humiliated. What I didn't expect was just how far they were willing to go. It started before dawn. I woke to a metallic hiss echoing through the street. At first I thought it was a sprinkler system, but then came the dull thud of a heavy knife against rubber. My gut clenched. I pulled on boots and sprinted outside, flashlight in hand. The beam caught a tall figure in a dark jacket crouched by one of the semis. He jerked upright, face half hidden under a ball cap, then bolted into the shadows. By sunrise, the damage was clear. 20 tires lay shredded, rubber flaps curling off the rims. My cousin Marcus stood with his driver's fury radiating off him. "That's over $100 grand, he growled. "You don't just slash truck tires and walk away. This is criminal." The police came within the hour. Flashing lights splashed against the rows of trucks like a crime scene. Officers crouched, snapping photos, jotting notes. "Classic vandalism," one said. "You got any cameras out here?" Before I could answer, a familiar voice called from across the street. "I do. Mrs. Henderson, 78, frail as a willow branch, shuffled toward us with her iPad. She was known for baking cookies for block parties, not for playing detective. But that morning, she was my guardian angel. "I check my doorbell camera every morning," she said, tapping the screen. "Caught this around 3 a.m. The officers crowded around her tablet. And there he was, James Quinn, the slick developer who'd wormed his way onto the board last year. The video showed him circling the semi's blade, flashing under the streetlight as he methodically carved into each tire. The younger officer let out a low whistle. "That's pretty definitive." The older one nodded. "We'll bring him in." By noon, Quinn was in custody, but the victory felt hollow. If a sitting HOA board member would stoop to midnight vandalism, what else were they hiding? That question was answered faster than I imagined. At 9 o'clock sharp, a caravan of county SUVs pulled into Cedar Hollow. Out stepped Maria Ramirez, the environmental inspector, flanked by a half-dozen officials carrying soil kits and measuring rods. Neighbors peeked from curtains as the team headed straight for the creek bed. Maria crouched, scraping a trowel against the fill. Her frown deepened with every sample bag she sealed. Non-permeable material. Exactly what I suspected. She stood and addressed me directly. "This violates Section 44 of the Clean Water Act. Whoever authorized this project is in serious trouble. Fines start at $225,000 per day, plus mandatory restoration." I blinked, struggling to process the figure. $250,000 per day. As if summoned by those words, Karen's silver Mercedes screeched to a stop at the curb. She stormed across my lawn, heels sinking into the grass, fury etched into every line of her face. "What is the meaning of this?" she snapped. Maria rose slowly, badge glinting. "County Environmental Protection. We have full authority to investigate violations." Karen's voice softened to false sweetness. "This was a beautification project, fully approved." Maria cut her off. "Approved by whom?" "Because we have no record of permits, no impact study, no water diversion application. Nothing." For once, Karen faltered. Her eyes darted from Maria to me, then back. "This can all be resolved privately." "Not how this works," Maria said coolly. "My report goes to the state. They'll take this very seriously." The murmurs of neighbors watching from the sidewalk grew louder. For the first time, Karen didn't look like the iron-fisted queen of Cedar Hollow. She looked cornered. But predators fight hardest when trapped. That night, a new notice appeared taped to my front door. "Violation unauthorized vehicles. Daily fines $200. Eviction proceedings to begin after 30 days. My stomach nodded. They were targeting me again, this time with paperwork. I called Trevor Mitchell, a retired engineer, who'd quietly supported me during the last meeting. He picked up on the first ring. "Got one too," he said grimly. "So did Sophia and Mrs. Abernathy." Funny how the only people not getting these notices are board loyalists. Retaliation, plain and simple. We gathered in my living room that evening. Sophia spread out property maps across the dining table, tracing blue lines with her finger. "These aren't just decorative creeks. They're headwater tributaries feeding into Riverside Lake. That makes them state protected." Trevor nodded. "And the HOA buried them without permits. That's a felony in some cases." "Mrs. Abernathy clutched her teacup. "My late husband was treasurer before Karen pushed him out. He always warned that developers were sniffing around trying to buy influence." Her words sent a chill down my spine. What if the creek destruction wasn't just about aesthetics? What if it was about money, about opening land for projects that would never be approved otherwise? The doorbell rang, making us all jump. I opened it to find Catherine Lane, Karen's sister-in-law, perfectly composed yet trembling around the edges. She stepped inside, clutching a USB drive. "There's something you need to see," she whispered. We gathered around my laptop as she plugged it in. Emails, contracts, photographs filled the screen. "Karen's not acting alone," Catherine said, her voice shaking. "She's been working with a developer, Thomas Quinn, to divert the waterways. The plan is to build luxury townhomes on the floodplain. They promise board members free upgrades, new kitchens, pools, even roof replacements in exchange for their help. James was the enforcer. But Karen, she's the one orchestrating it. My chest tightened. The creek destruction hadn't been about beauty, it had been about profit. And now, with inspectors circling and neighbors questioning their whole scheme, teetered on collapse. Catherine closed her eyes, tears streaking her cheeks. I stayed silent too long. But after seeing what James did last night, I can't anymore. They're dangerous, and they won't stop until someone stops them. I glanced around the room at Trevor, Sophia, and Mrs. Abernathy. The weight of her words settled like lead. This wasn't just an HOA dispute anymore. It was corruption, systematic, deliberate, and far bigger than any of us realized. And we were the only ones standing in its way. The night Catherine handed me that USB drive, I barely slept. Long after she left, I sat at my dining table with Trevor and Sophia scrolling through files, my mind racing. Every click revealed another thread in the web. Karen and Quinn had spun invoices to fake contractors, emails promising upgrades to board members, legal drafts prepared against anyone who resisted. This wasn't just HOA overreach. This was organized corruption. By dawn, my printer had churned out hundreds of pages. The smell of hot paper filled the house as I spread the documents across the floor. Trevor leaned over one set of plans, his finger tracing blue lines on the plat maps. "See here," he muttered, "the creeks weren't nuisances. They were obstacles, barriers to development. Karen wanted them gone because Quinn's company needed clear floodplains to push townhomes through permitting." Sophia nodded grimly. "And the board bought in because they were getting kickbacks disguised as home improvements. A pool here, a new roof there, classic bribery." I felt my stomach twist. So they sacrificed our community for profit and buried my family's creek in the process. Mrs. Abernathy, who had joined us despite her arthritis, dabbed her eyes with a tissue. My Herbert always suspected they were up to something. He used to say, "Developers don't care about neighbors. They care about numbers." Looks like he was right. We all fell silent. The weight of what we'd uncovered pressed down hard. Catherine had taken a risk bringing this to us. If Karen discovered her betrayal, she would retaliate viciously. As if to prove the point, the first sign of retaliation came that very morning. A fresh violation notice flapped against my front door, taped there like a scarlet letter, bushes exceeding height restriction. Daily fine, $100. I tore it down, jaw tight, then marched across the street to Trevor's house. Sure enough, the same notice was taped to his door, except his violation claimed unapproved patio furniture. Sophia texted me a photo of hers improper driveway edging. Even Mrs. Abernathy wasn't spared. She called in tears, saying she'd been threatened with immediate eviction proceedings. "They're targeting us," Trevor said, holding his notice like it was toxic. "Everyone connected to you is being hit." "Good," I said through clenched teeth. "It means we've got them cornered." But inside, I felt the first ripple of fear. Karen was escalating, and cornered animals lash out. That evening, we regrouped at my house. Catherine sat stiffly in a dining chair, her hands shaking around a cup of untouched tea. "They know," she whispered. Karen called me. She said, "If I keep talking, something bad will happen not just to me, but to all of you." The words chilled me more than I wanted to admit. For weeks, this had been a war of bylaws, fines, and protests. But now it smelled like intimidation. "We can't back down," I said, though my voice sounded harsher than I intended. "We've got evidence that ties Karen and Quinn to illegal development plans. If we hand this over to state investigators and the press, they can't bury it." Trevor nodded. "Agreed. But we have to act fast. If Quinn suspects Catherine leaked this, he'll shred the rest of the records." Sophia pulled out her phone. "I've got contacts at the Department of Environmental Quality. With this evidence, they'll have no choice but to investigate." Mrs. Abernathy's voice was shaky, but her eyes shone with quiet resolve. "I'll speak at the next meeting. They took my pond years ago and called it a mosquito hazard. I stayed quiet then, but not anymore. We made copies, triple backups, and mailed envelopes to trusted allies outside the neighborhood. If Karen tried to silence us, the truth would still surface." The following morning, Diane Fleming, the local reporter, met us by the ruined creek with her camera crew. Catherine hesitated, her fear palpable, but then she stepped into the frame. Her voice quivered at first, then strengthened. "These waterways aren't nuisances. They're protected tributaries. The HOA buried them to clear land for development and bribed board members to look the other way." The broadcast that night hit Cedar Hollow like a bomb. Phones rang non-stop. Environmental groups pledged support. The county commissioner announced an emergency review. Suddenly, Karen's kingdom wasn't just under scrutiny, it was under siege. But Karen fought back with venom. The next day, another round of notices blanketed doors, this time to nearly a dozen families who had spoken kindly to me in recent days. Some were accused of unauthorized paint colors, others of excessive holiday lights. It was blatant retaliation, and everyone knew it. Neighbors began whispering at mailboxes and driveways in the grocery store. Some feared being targeted, but others were emboldened. I overheard one man mutter, "If she thinks she can scare us all into silence, she's got another thing coming." That night, as I sat on my porch, the glow of headlights drew my attention. A black SUV idled across the street, engine low, lights off. My pulse quickened. It stayed there for nearly an hour, unmoving, before finally rolling away into the darkness. The next morning, Catherine arrived again, her face pale, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's worse than you think. I found draft lawsuits on James's computer, prepared to sue each of you for defamation and interference. Quinn's plan is to drown you in legal fees until you give up." Trevor exhaled slowly, his jaw tight. "Then we don't just defend ourselves, we strike first. With the press, with regulators, with the community. If they want to fight, fine. But this time, it won't be one they can win." I looked out the window at the hulking silhouettes of the trucks, still lined along the easement. They had started as a stunt, a way to shove back against Karen's arrogance. Now they stood as a symbol of resistance. And as fear mingled with determination in my chest, I realized something: this wasn't just about saving a creek anymore. It was about saving an entire neighborhood from the grip of corruption. Karen had drawn the battle lines, but we were the ones preparing for war. The recall election was set for 30 days out, but the fallout hit long before ballots were cast. Cedar Hollow, once the kind of neighborhood where arguments rarely escalated beyond misplaced recycling bins, now buzzed with tension. Neighbors eyed each other across driveways, whispers replaced small talk, and every HOA notice taped to a door felt like a weapon. I woke one morning to find a fresh violation taped crookedly across my front door. Bushes exceed height restriction by 2 inches. Daily fine $50. The absurdity might have been laughable if it weren't for the mounting stack of similar notices on my kitchen counter, trash bins, gutter alignment, even a hairline crack in the driveway. Every one of us who dared to oppose Karen's regime was being targeted. Trevor called me minutes later, his voice tight with anger. Got the same notice for unauthorized patio furniture. The chair's been on my porch for 7 years. They're using the HOA as a cudgel. Sophia texted a photo of her own violation, unapproved landscaping stones. Mrs. Abernathy, voice trembling over the phone, said she'd received threats of eviction proceedings. We decided enough was enough. That night, the 5 of us gathered again in my living room, Catherine clutching the USB drive like it was contraband, Sophia spreading maps across the dining table, Trevor flipping through bylaws and Mrs. Abernathy quietly knitting as if to calm herself. "This isn't about creeks anymore," Trevor said, his voice low but firm. "This is about corruption and intimidation tactics to keep us silent. They're desperate." Sophia tapped the maps. "And desperate people make mistakes. Look, Karen's been funneling projects into Quinn's company. These contracts weren't even bid out. Classic conflict of interest." Catherine swallowed hard. "There's more." She slid a folder across the table. Inside were draft legal documents, unsigned, but chilling lawsuits prepared against us, personally accusing us of defamation, property, interference, even conspiracy. James kept these on his laptop. "Quinn's plan is to bleed you dry with litigation if you don't back down." The air in the room thickened. It was one thing to face HOA fines. It was another to be dragged into court by a developer with deep pockets. I leaned forward. "Then we don't just defend. We go on the offensive. Diane's story already cracked the shell. Now we give the state investigators everything: emails, contracts, financials. We make this too big to bury." Trevor nodded. "And we rally the neighbors. Karen thrives because people feel isolated. If we show them they're not alone, she loses her power." The plan was set. The next day, Diane returned, this time with a cameraman and a microphone. She filmed us standing by the gutted creek, Catherine reluctantly stepping into the frame. "These waterways aren't just puddles," she said, voice steady despite her shaking hands. "They're protected headwaters vital to the county watershed. The HOA buried them without permits for profit." The segment aired that evening, and it hit harder than the first. By morning, my phone buzzed nonstop. Environmental groups called, offering legal representation. Neighbors I barely knew dropped by with words of support. Even the county commissioner left a voicemail: "We're opening a formal investigation." But Karen wasn't finished. That evening, she stormed onto my porch, flanked by Elaine and two other board members. She didn't bother with niceties. "You think you're clever," she spat, her voice trembling with fury. "But you're out of your depth. You don't know who you're dealing with." I met her glare calmly. "Oh, I think I do. And so does the state now." Her lips curled. "You'll regret this." Trevor, who had arrived minutes earlier, stepped out behind me. "Funny, Karen. That's exactly what people said about Nixon." For the first time, her mask cracked. She spun on her heel and marched away, heels stabbing the pavement. 2 nights later, the community center was packed for what Karen called a special session. Nearly every homeowner in Cedar Hollow showed up, some standing in the back, others spilling out into the hallway. Karen opened with her usual theatrics, talk of property values, of order of dangerous trucks and meddling troublemakers. But her voice lacked the certainty it once carried. When she finally paused, I rose slowly. "You want to talk about danger? How about destroying protected creeks without permits? How about bribing board members with home upgrades while laundering money through fake contracts? Or slashing truck tires in the dead of night?" Gasps rippled through the crowd. All eyes turned to Quinn, seated stiffly in the second row. The mention of the tire-slashing video made his face pale. Then Catherine stood. Her voice quivered, but carried. "I was silent too long, but everything he says is true. I saw the contracts. I saw the bribes, and I can't stay quiet while my neighbors are threatened." The room erupted, shouts, questions, accusations flying like sparks. Karen banged the gavel furiously, but no one listened. For the first time, she wasn't in control. Trevor stepped forward with his leather portfolio. I moved for a recall election effective immediately. Dozens of hands shot up. Karen's gavel slammed again, but the sound was swallowed by the roar of voices. Neighbors chanted, "Vote, vote, vote," her eyes locked on mine, blazing with venom. "You'll pay for this," she hissed. But for the first time since this war began, I felt the tide turn. The trucks had started it, the creek had fueled it, but now the entire neighborhood was awake. As I walked out into the cool night air, the sound of chanting still echoing behind me, I realized Karen was right about one thing: enemies of hers didn't last long in Cedar Hollow. But maybe, just maybe, neither would she. Election day arrived with an energy Cedar Hollow hadn't felt in years. Normally, HOA votes were sleepy affairs, barely a dozen homeowners showing up to rubber stamp whatever the board wanted. But that morning, the line to the community center stretched down the block. Neighbors stood with folded arms, clutching ballots like weapons. Conversations buzzed with anger, hope, and suspicion. I walked up slowly, my folder of evidence tucked under my arm, though by now most of its contents were already public knowledge. Diane's reports had aired twice more, the county had launched an inquiry, and Quinn's tire-slashing arrest was still fresh in everyone's minds. The trucks had been towed away only days before, but not before Marcus and his drivers delivered loads of stone and timber for the restoration project we'd started on the creek. Inside the hall, tension was suffocating. Karen sat stiffly at the front, her face powdered but pale eyes darting with nervous energy. Elaine hovered beside her, whispering frantically. Quinn was absent, still facing charges for vandalism, but his shadow lingered. I spotted Catherine in the second row head, bowed hands clenched tight in her lap. Across the aisle, Trevor and Sophia stood tall, greeting neighbors, handing out photocopies of bylaws and maps. Even Mrs. Abernathy, frail but determined, leaned on her cane near the sign-in table, telling anyone who would listen how Karen's crew had targeted her with fake violations. The meeting began with Margaret Tanner, acting chair, tapping the microphone. Her voice quivered as she tried to project authority. "We're here to address community concerns and conduct a recall election of the board." Karen jumped in before Margaret could say more. "Before we descend into chaos, I want to remind everyone what's at stake. Property values, order, safety. This," she pointed directly at me, "this man has endangered all of it with his circus of trucks and baseless accusations." Murmurs rippled, but fewer nods than before. The spell of her authority was cracking. I stood unfolding a copy of the county's environmental citation. My voice carried steady, not loud but deliberate. "The only danger here is corruption." The county confirmed the creek was a protected tributary. Its destruction violated the Clean Water Act. "Fines are mounting daily, fines we will all pay unless this board is removed." Quinn slashed tires in the middle of the night. "We have video," and Catherine Lane, I gestured toward her, risked everything to show us the bribes, the secret contracts, the lies. "This isn't about me. It's about whether Cedar Hollow belongs to its residents or to a handful of people lining their pockets." For a long moment, silence. Then Catherine rose, voice trembling but audible. "He's telling the truth. I saw it all. Karen brokered the deals. Quinn arranged the upgrades. My husband James enforced their threats. I stayed quiet too long. But I can't anymore. Gasps filled the room. Margaret tried to interject, but Trevor stepped forward, holding up the bylaws. I call for the vote. Right now. Ballots were passed, pens scratched, neighbors leaned over clipboards. The tension was unbearable, like a courtroom waiting for a jury verdict. Karen sat rigid, eyes fixed on the floor, lips pressed into a thin line. When the counting finished, Margaret's voice cracked as she read the result. By majority vote, the current board is recalled. Effective immediately. Applause erupted, cheers bouncing off the walls. Some neighbors hugged. Others wept quietly. Karen stood abruptly, her chair screeching against the floor. She glared at me one final time, venom in her eyes. "This isn't over," she hissed. Then she stormed out, Elaine scurrying behind her. The room exhaled as if a great weight had lifted. Trevor was elected interim president by unanimous voice vote. Sophia volunteered for the new environmental committee. Mrs. Abernathy, smiling through tears, agreed to serve as treasurer once more. For the first time in months, Cedar Hollow felt like a neighborhood, not a battlefield. But our work wasn't done. The next week, county officials returned with more inspectors. They confirmed what Dr. Tran had warned: multiple creeks had been illegally buried, and stormwater drainage was compromised. Fines exceeded $1 million. Northbridge Partners, Quinn's company, withdrew their development application under threat of criminal charges. By month's end, both Karen and Quinn were indicted, Karen for fraud and conspiracy, Quinn for vandalism and bribery. Meanwhile, our restoration project bloomed. Marcus and his crew donated labor, neighbors brought shovels and gloves, and even former loyalists showed up ashamed but willing to help. The sound of water trickling back through the stones was like music. Wildlife returned, frogs, croaking dragonflies skimming the surface, even birds that hadn't been seen in years. We named it Community Creek Park, and children played along its banks, while parents lingered on new benches we built from reclaimed wood. At the dedication ceremony, Catherine cut the ribbon, her eyes wet with relief. "I can't undo my silence," she said softly, "but I can spend the rest of my life making this right." Trevor stepped to the microphone next. "We thought the HOA existed to protect us. Instead, it was used against us. But what saved Cedar Hollow wasn't bylaws or fines, it was neighbors standing together. Let this be the start of a new chapter." As applause thundered, I stepped aside, looking at the creek glimmering in the afternoon. Sunday, I thought of Emma with her tadpoles, of Tyler skipping stones, of all the memories we'd nearly lost. And I realized this battle had given us something unexpected, not just justice, but community. Karen had been right about one thing. Enemies of hers rarely lasted long in Cedar Hollow. But this time, it was her reign that had ended. That night, as I sat on my porch listening to the creek's gentle flow, I reflected on what it had all meant. I'd started this fight angry, fueled by spite and stubbornness. But what carried us through wasn't rage, it was solidarity. When neighbors stopped being afraid, Karen lost her power. The lesson was simple but profound. Bullies thrive in silence, but they crumble when ordinary people stand together. To everyone watching this story, I'll say this: protect what matters, speak up when it counts, and never underestimate the strength of a community united. And if you've ever fought an HOA battle of your own, drop a comment below. Share your story. And don't forget to subscribe, because trust me, you won't want to miss what comes next.